What's going on, Bears fans? Welcome to another episode of Chicago Bears Central. I'm holding it down today on Chicago Bears Central Daily. I'm Haize, one of the hosts here, holding it down for C-Dub and Bobby. On today's episode, we're going to be talking all line, the defensive line and the offensive line. We'll get into what the defensive line is going to look like without Robert Quinn if he does not return to the Chicago Bears, and if the Bears' defensive line is actually in a worse place than the offensive line is, considering the rookies that are ready to step up on that O-line. We'll get into all that and more on today's Chicago Bears Central.
You are now tuned in to Chicago Bears Central, your number one place for all Chicago Bears news and content.
All right, Bears fans, so we're jumping right in. And so this episode, I wanted to talk to you guys about the Bears' offensive and defensive line. So first off, I do want to start with the defensive line, and mainly because the questions that surround Robert Quinn. Is he going to return? Is he going to be moved? Things like that. We don't really have any solid answers right now. Last that we heard was, I believe, from Matt Nagy, in which he said that is up to Ryan Poles and Robert Quinn to work out. But I want to ask this. With that being said, with the question marks surrounding Robert Quinn, and I know we've been talking about the offensive line since the offseason. Well, we're still in the offseason, right? For months at this point, what's going to happen with that Bears offensive line? But what about the Bears defensive line? What type of situation is the defensive line going to be in without having Robert Quinn there? Robert Quinn, who's coming off a monster season. Not to say that the Bears D-line is completely barren without him, but he was such a big part of what the Bears defensive line and that defense as a whole was going to look like. So now looking at the defensive line, looking at a player like a Trevis Gipson, who had a strong season last season in his snaps. Wasn't the starter, wasn't even looked at to necessarily come in this season and be the starter, but him building off his 2021 season, could he be a big part of the Chicago Bears' future on that defensive line? Those questions are going to be looked at to be answered this season. When you look at Alaquin Muhammad, right? He's likely a starter on the other defensive end spot. What does he be able to bring? But I'm really looking at Trevis Gipson, focusing on him here, focusing on just what he could do if he's shown flashes during training camp, if he continues to develop. Is he and could he be at some point the linchpin of that Bears defensive line? Now I know some people may not agree with that, and that's fine. But it does raise some questions to be answered there. What is this defense as a whole going to look like without Robert Quinn, but specifically that defensive line, the point of attack? What is that going to look like? How much pressure are we going to be able to put on the quarterback without Robert Quinn and what he was able to do? It raises a lot of questions, and ones that I'm actually surprised that me, C-Dub, and Bobby haven't talked about a little bit more is because Robert Quinn was factored in to be such a big part, just how that changes some things for the Chicago Bears. So now without Robert Quinn, and for the nature of this conversation, we're just going to operate as if Robert Quinn is not going to be with the Chicago Bears in the 22-23 season. Now, if he does, take this whole episode, throw it away. But now looking at that, we have Justin Jones. We're looking at Tonga. We're looking at Trevis Gipson. We're looking at Alaquin Muhammad as that starting defensive line. Now, what does that really get you, right? Where does that sit you? How much pressure are they able to put on the quarterback? With Justin Jones serving as that 3-tech, that position that we originally were hoping that Larry Ogunjobi was going to still be able to come in and be, and he ended up signing elsewhere. Well, how does that change things? We already know what the linebacker situation is going to be like with Roquan Smith, Nicholas Morrow, and Matthew Adams, and even the questions that still remain to be there, right? But now that defensive line, is that defensive line, it loses a lot of power when you think of it, like just the named power there, right? With Robert Quinn not being in that anymore. And so those questions, that's just a question that came to mind that I wanted to talk about on this episode to see how you guys felt about what that meant and how the Bears defensive line is going to stack up this season. Let me know what you guys think. I think, I know I brought up Gipson a lot on this, and while I do have high hopes for Trevis, I'm not expecting him to step in and all of a sudden be this sacking king or anything, or completely replace Robert Quinn. But as I've been talking about a lot on these solo episodes, is just that when you do have somebody who steps up maybe into a different and takes a leap that you may not have initially expected, it can completely change the outlook of your team and the future outlook on your team. So I want to hear it down below. Out of those projected starters that I mentioned, do you think there's going to be a different player that ends up starting? But how do you think that defensive line is going to stack up this season in the NFL with, like I said, projected right now, minus Robert Quinn, Alaquin Muhammad at one of the defensive ends, Trevis Gipson at the other defensive end, and then we're looking at Justin Jones, and Tonga being at those defensive tackle spots. Let me know what you guys think about that one. But next up, we do want to get and talk about the offensive line. Let's go to the other side of the ball, right? And so with what we've heard so far, after training camp, after OTAs, there are a lot of rookies right now in our offensive line. So looking at the final week of OTAs, we saw Braxton Jones step into that and getting those reps at left tackle, the starting left tackle. Then we saw Tevin Jenkins was demoted to the second team, but we're not going to buy too much into that. But the fact that this team is moving around, trying to find the best combination of the players that are going to give us the best offensive line possible, I think the time has passed for us to think that anything or anyone else is going to be coming in on this. So when you look at it, we're looking at Tevin Jenkins being the starter out there, Sam Mustipher being a starter out there as well, Braxton Jones being that left tackle, Cody Whitehair probably being the left guard, Lucas Patrick at the center. While this offensive line isn't tested, right? And there are a lot of young players in this offensive line. We've even seen Zachary Thomas in there, I think, taking some reps with the starters as well. How does this offensive line end up shaking out? And this is one of the biggest questions. This has been one of the biggest questions. Is coming into the season, coming into the draft, there were two things that we wanted to see the front office take care of. That's the wide receiver, and that was the the offensive line. Now, they went in and did get a lot of young offensive linemen. They didn't go as high on the wide receivers as what we thought they were. They did get Velius Jones, who may be poised to do a lot more things than what we were expecting. But still, with that being said, how does this offensive line stack up? That's the question. There's so much out there right now that's left to be answered, and we'll probably won't really know who's going to be that starting offensive line for sure until we get through preseason. It may very well be whatever offensive line starts that first game in preseason is not the offensive line that starts the first game of the actual season. But we're hearing a lot of good things coming from them right now. Hearing a lot of positivity as we've heard overall. But that's the thing with this, is that having those young, untested players right there on the offensive line. How does Matt Eberflus looking at that? Jenkins, Borum, like at the right guard position. And maybe that's Luke Getsy's ultimate decision to make there. It's clear that the starting positions are up for grabs. That's the one thing that's clear, is that there is a competition and a lot of flexibility on who starts at what. And that could be promising. It could be something that ends up biting us, that we don't have like somebody who's just a surefire thing. But right now they're trying to find the best combinations and trying to look at probably that. How do they work in the running game? How do they work in the passing game? Who's better in the running or the passing game, or who gives you the best combination of both? But looking at this offensive line and the defensive line, as we did in this daily episode, it just makes there's a lot of questions on both lines. So I want to hear from you guys. Who do you think is ultimately going to be the starters on the Bears offensive line and defensive line? And how do you think they're going to stack up this season? I already asked it with the defensive line. I want to hear from you guys on this one. Unless there's a move to be made, how do you guys think this offensive line is ultimately going to stack up? Do you think they're going to do enough to protect Justin Fields to where he's not running around for his life out there, and we're able to see him continue to develop? Because look, the offensive line is going to have as big of an impact on Justin Fields' development and him being comfortable in going through his progressions and things like that. We're going to have to see the offensive line be able to protect him. We didn't even touch on the running game as well. Montgomery and Khalil Herbert are projected, I have, to have pretty big seasons this season, being that 1-2 punch. But if we don't have an offensive line, it'd be very difficult for everyone. So let me know what you guys think about everything down below on the lines, on offense and defense. Thank you for tuning in to Chicago Bears Central. I'm your host, Haize. You can follow the podcast at Shy Bears Central on every social media platform. You can also send us any feedback, questions, comments, concerns, chicagobearscentral@gmail.com. Lastly, if you want to leave a text and or voicemail, you can do so at 773-270-2799. Thank you for tuning in to Chicago Bears Central. For C-Dub, for Bobby, I'm Haize. We out. Bear down. See you lovely and beautiful people tomorrow. Peace, y'all.
This has
been a presentation of the Break Media.